Thank you for joining today's webinar, Mythbusters Cloud Cost Savings, with Cindy Menke and Clint Adkins from Coretek Services. During today's session, we will be discussing the truth behind cloud cost savings and be giving real-world examples. My name is Hannah Westra, and I will be moderating today's session. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items to address. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available to you after the session. If you have any questions during the session, you can enter them into the question box, or if you prefer to save them for at the end, we will have a Q&A session. We will follow up the webinar today with next steps for you to take to migrate to the cloud, and will be and additional information can be found at coretekservices.com. So again, just a brief introduction. With us today we have Cindy Menke from Coretek Services, Clint Atkins, also from Coretek Services. He is the Managed Services Practice Manager. Cindy is the Director of Sales. And again, I'm Hannah Westra, moderator for today's webinar. And with that, I will hand it over to Cindy.
Thank you, Hannah. And you were right in saying good morning and good afternoon, because Clint is actually sitting in California where it is morning for him, and here we are in beautiful Michigan where it's afternoon for us. So thanks everyone for being on today. And hi, Clint, so excited to be here today to talk about the realities of cost savings that can be had in the cloud. So to stay on track, we're going to follow the agenda, talk about the business value of moving to the cloud and cloud architecture. And then we're going to take a deep dive into where does the savings come from. So we have some of our own tools that we've worked through ourselves that we've used with customers to do some real-world total cost analysis. And so we're going to share that today. And then on that where to start button, we're going to talk about how do you start that journey to the cloud yourselves. What workloads should you look at? You know, what things to consider, that sort of things. So there you go. Let's get into it. So let's start by talking about some of the industry standards that we see out there. These are some bullet points that we pulled out from a recent IDC report talking about the business value of going to the cloud. So Clint, from a managed services perspective, I know that you can speak to those bullets on the left. So can you share some of what you see out there and how it compares to this IDC report?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so from a supportability and administration perspective, managing the cloud environments are a lot simpler for businesses to manage their environments. You don't have to worry as much about the hardware that the servers and infrastructure are running on. It's always running, and that's handled by the cloud provider. So from a support and administration, it's a lot less time and less expensive to manage, and enables agility. Agility is another one of the key pieces where you can spin up and down services as you want to, and we'll get into that a little bit more throughout this webinar. But the agility of the cloud and giving you flexibility to enable services quickly and cost effectively is incredibly valuable.
That's awesome. So on the right side, you'll see the business value highlights. And again, this is coming directly from the IDC report, where they're saying across industries, they see an overall average of 560% 5-year return on investment. That's a huge number, huge. It cannot be ignored. A couple more bullets down, 64% lower total cost of ownership. Again, we're going to dig into some of our tools that we use. Another one that's worth talking about is 118% more applications being delivered. And that's because of the quicker time to market. So a lot of our customers who write their own applications for their own specific purposes and their own customers, they can go to market that much faster and be that much more agile and more competitive by being able to bring those applications to market quicker than their competitors. And then another key metric there is 81% less downtime overall by running your applications and your workloads in the cloud. So pretty hefty data there to consider. So another business driver that we see, Clint, in working with our customers that's not listed here as the IDC report is the shift from CapEx to OpEx. So are you seeing that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So capital expenditures, they're typically meant for more static investments, and operating expenses are typically intended for more fluctuating costs. So as technology is changing, it makes sense to consider as much IT expenditure as possible to go into that OpEx model to allow you to fluctuate instead of purchasing, a big investment to predict the next 5 to 10 years worth of consumption, or even the next 2 years worth of usage that you're going to do. Instead, switch that more to an OpEx model type thought process where you're only paying for the IT services you actually need, and it can scale as you need to, scale up or down based on what your requirements. So Cindy, it really is a great point. Definitely looking at that OpEx model and considering how that helps your business be more agile is incredibly important.
Right. I know for both of us, we've been in this industry a really long time, and in other jobs I've had in the past, and having to provision, future-proof my investment by future provisioning. How difficult an exercise is that, and have to convince your company to make large storage investments because you're basing it on what you think future growth is going to be, and then getting locked into those technology investments that you can't get out of, and then being stuck with certain models and so forth, and then ultimately over-provisioning and overspending. And so moving to that OpEx model for technology investments makes a lot of sense, and obviously because we see more and more people going that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%, Cindy.
All right. So if we take a look at where the savings actually come from, this graph does a pretty good job of explaining the hard and soft cost savings. So why don't we go through these one by one, Clint. The hardware cost, that's kind of obvious, your servers, switches, storage. Anything else come to mind there?
Yeah, I mean, that's primarily it. Rack space and different things, but that'll talk a little bit later on facility costs also. But yeah, think about how many times we've all purchased various pieces of hardware that we thought would either cover the load, be right-sized for the load, or and it turns out to either be way too much and we just don't need that hardware, all of that hardware, or it's too little and we've got to continue to add more to it. So yeah, definitely hardware is a big savings.
Well, even in today's technology, it changes so fast. So I know that some of the platforms that we work with, they're changing models like every 6 months or like 4 to 6 months. So something that you might scope out would fit a workload today. If you wait 6 months and try to buy that same configuration, it doesn't exist anymore and you have to rescope. So being able to not worry about that hardware layer and just move workloads to the cloud without that consideration takes a big load off. Software license costs, so can you expound on that?
Yeah, so where I look at that is primarily in 2 parts. One is you have your server operating systems. There are a lot of organizations that don't completely understand their server operating system license costs. So when they have large, complex EA enterprise agreements, they may be overpaying for their operating systems. I was with a customer actually yesterday, and we were talking through, looking through their Microsoft EA and trying to understand what all they exactly do own and what all they actually are leveraging from that EA. And one of the key components that the customer said to me is one of the things that the customer actually said to me was, we are experiencing a problem with over provisioning our licenses. They had all purchased data center server licenses, but they're only using a couple of Windows servers per host in a lot of scenarios, and so they're overpaying for those licenses. From a software perspective, you see a significant savings for when you go to the cloud, because you're actually paying for that software OS perspective. You're paying for it as you consume that server.
So no more crazy over-provisioning. That makes complete sense. So the next two slides there, the bar graphs, I mean the core server labor costs and the workload-specific labor costs. Talking about your FTEs or full-time employees, or the staff that you have to maintain this, is always a touchy subject, because no one wants to think about losing their job, because you're going to save so much money and you won't need them anymore. But here's the problem, is that people waste so much time on just maintenance overhead stuff, where if we could free up those valuable employees to work on more strategic business objectives instead, so much more value to the business by being able to do that and get rid of those mundane tasks that can just be offloaded into the cloud. And then the implementation costs. I know that, shame on me, we're a professional services company, so we make money doing professional services, but hey, guess what? When you go to the cloud, you don't need all that. If you're, once you're starting a project, maybe bringing a new application workload in, and if you were going to, compare and contrast, if you were going to do that on-prem, the cost of buying the hardware, getting it set up, paying for professional services to set things up, and so on and so forth. So all of those implementation costs get slashed dramatically by going to the cloud. And then, Clint, you talked a little bit about facilities costs already, so that can be substantial as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It absolutely can. So not only the the power and cooling and lights and floor space, racks, things like that, data pipes for those data center connections. So your actual connectivity, your data connectivity, but also your facilities costs from a overall square footage perspective. So whether you're leasing or purchasing, have purchased the floor or the data center, that is incredibly expensive and very expensive to maintain and keep current. I've heard a lot of different companies talk about looking at different data center migrations, because they put in state-of-the-art data centers 10 to 20 years ago and spent a lot of money doing that. And yep. Go ahead, Cindy.
Sorry, you cut out for a second. I thought we may have lost you.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Can you guys? Is this better, Cindy?
Yep, we can hear you good. So anyway, back to this slide then. So this lays out all the hard and soft savings, and I briefly touched on it, but there's a time savings here as well. Again, as I mentioned in that implementation cost, if you're bringing on a new workload, the time it takes to cut POs, bring hardware in, set things up, get people in there to start building and so forth, all that time goes away too. So huge savings that you can rely on in dollars and cents from a hard and soft perspective, but a big time savings as well, which directly feeds into your competitive advantage, your agility, and your speed to market. So again, if you go to the next slide, and we can talk for a minute about your tangible savings opportunities. So first off are the hardware support contracts year over year. So we all know that for every piece of hardware that you have sitting on your floor somewhere, there's a contract that goes with it to support that piece of hardware. Those contracts basically go away, right, Clint?
Yeah, absolutely. You no longer need those if you're going to a cloud model. Now, you may have some sort of hybrid model, so you will most likely still have some, but the vast majority of them will significantly reduce.
Got it. That third bullet down, DR site savings can eventually go away completely. That's a pretty bold statement. Is that really true?
You know, it really is, especially when you think about DR sites and saving from a savings perspective. If you can move everything to the cloud and have your employees work remotely from home and have full access to their data and applications, it's absolutely something you can do. And with Azure, the way it's set up with multiple data centers throughout the country and throughout the world, you can absolutely set up DR sites throughout it and enable you to completely remove those facilities.
Got it. So I know that that last bullet speaks to platform as a service, things like Exchange as a service and you know, SaaS, SAP, SQL as a service, backup as a service. You know, you think back, you know, most of the world has now moved to Office 365 and doing Exchange in the cloud. It wasn't that long ago, all of us were still dealing with those Exchange servers on-prem. And, you know, I was a director of IT back in the day when I ran those Exchange servers on-prem. And, oh my gosh, you know, backing them up and if they ever crashed and getting the data back and nightmare. And to think about how easy it is now just to put it in the cloud and completely eliminated that overhead, those headaches, the people that were required to manage those, the reliability factor, amazing. And I know before this started we were talking a little bit, shame on me, a couple months ago I left my laptop on the airplane, never got it back, panicked until I got to the office, and then I was reminded that I switched to OneDrive for Business a couple months ago. And I kind of forgot about that. So I was given a new laptop, put my credentials in, and guess what? All my email was there, all my documents were there, didn't miss a beat, all because it was in the cloud. It completely saved my you-know-what. So definitely an intangible benefit for sure. So let's get into exactly what kind of savings that we're talking about. So now we're going to get into where the rubber meets the road, actual calculation. So here's an easy example. If we just look at what it costs to run a single VM in the cloud. So this is just an MSRP price of a, it's a 2-core, 4 gig, 4 gig of RAM VM running in the cloud, what it would cost if it were running there 744 working hours for the whole month, $152. Now, one of the big savings that comes from the cloud is being able to run those workloads only when you need them. And so when you're running a VM in your own data center, of course it's going to be up 24/7. And while it's up, you're paying for that floor space and the heating and the cooling and whatever. But if I can run that same VM in the cloud and I can run it only when I need it, let's say half of the time, I only pay for what I'm using then. So immediately, right out of the gate, I could potentially save $75 a month on one VM. Now, how many VMs do most people have running in their environments? Seriously, from a small environment, you know, 50 to 100, a large environment, thousands?
Yeah, that's a huge savings you can really do by figuring out how much you actually need to run those VMs, how much time.
So this is an easy example. We'll get into some examples in a second here, but let's go to the next slide and talk about some computing demands. So we talk about running an application half of the time. This is a very busy slide, but give us a second and it will make sense. Along that top line are examples of how an application might run. These are typical workloads. There are applications in everyone's environment. Usually about 30% of the time you'll have an application that is on, then it's off. It's on and it's off. So Clint, you had a great example of that one.
Yeah. So we have a couple different customers actually who primarily truly work more of a 7 to 5 p.m. type shift between their different employees, and there's maybe some people who extend to 6 or 6:30 or something along those lines. But truly do not do work, or at least their primary work, during the evening hours, during evening and throughout the night, and as well as on weekends. So we have customers that are able to literally shut down the majority of their data center application functionality to save money during those periods. So instead of spending, $150 per server, as Cindy had shown on the slide before, they truly are cutting that down by a significant amount in order to really truly use those computing demands based on their business demands.
That makes sense. I know you mentioned that we have some customers who are running desktop as a service, so they're running their desktops in the cloud. So why would you run someone's desktop 24 hours a day? You're only going to run their desktop their working hours, which, so now you go from 744 working hours a month down to 168 or so instead. So that's a significant drop by being able to just turn that VM on when you need it. So again, going along the top, then you'll have other applications that are growing. You put them in, and you put a limited number of users on them, and maybe it's in a pilot sort of mode. And then as you add employees or as you expand that application with more data, it will begin to grow. So another great example of why build out a huge infrastructure for what you think is going to be your growth 2 years from now. You can build it to today and let it grow with you. Third one next is unpredictable bursting. Retail customers with who spike at the holidays is a good example of that. The next one, predictable bursting, where it's going to be on, off, and then not that many that actually run steady state. So if you look at now, look at the bar on the very, very bottom, and you'll see what we have identified are averages, industry averages. So if you look at a typical environment, about 30% of your apps probably run in that on-off state. Probably about 15% are growing. Probably about 25% have unpredictable bursting, where 20% predictably burst, and then the other 10% that are kind of steady state at all times. Now compare that to the graphs that you see in the middle. So that very first graph, that's your predictable bursting or somewhat steady state. If you move those sorts of applications into the cloud, you will see a savings of about 20 to 30%. Those others, though, that next graph over, that would be a good example of something that's growing or something that's more on-off or a little bit unpredictable. But a big group of your applications, you can expect to save 60 to 80% by moving those into the cloud. So busy slide, but once you start to break it down, it starts to make sense. All right, so we showed an example of a VM, what it would cost to run a VM in the cloud. Now let's get into how we come up with these calculations. So if we came into your environment and we helped you do a TCO analysis of what applications in your environment would be worthwhile to move to the cloud and that sort of thing, this is the kind of an exercise that we would take you through. First, we would look at your current physical servers, and these are the calculations that we would use. We would look at your OS license, the number of hosts that you have, divided by 12 to come up with a monthly license cost. We would do the same with backup. How much is the license for that, plus how much is the storage for your backups, plus how much is the support, and then to come up with a monthly backup cost. Same thing with hardware maintenance, what you're paying for the maintenance, multiplied by your number of physical servers, again divided by 12 to come up with a monthly server maintenance cost. Same thing with hardware, except we do extrapolate that over 3 to 5 years depending on what your life cycle is in your own environment. Power and cooling, we actually took that slide out because it was very busy and has to do with kilowatt hours and stuff like that, which is way over my head. And then facilities costs, looking at that above power and cooling costs divided by the square foot of the facility and what actually gets paid for the square foot of the facility. So if we go to the next slide then, and Clint, if you want to walk us through, here's an actual example of a physical on-prem calculation where we looked at a DL. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so looking at just a standard normal server that's got 8 cores, 8 gigs of RAM, and you're looking at it as the server license about $300 a year, and if you break that up by per month divided by 12, we look at the actual servers and the backup, how many physical servers it takes, as well as the cost of those, hardware maintenance, the hardware maintenance cost, the actual server hardware itself, assuming it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $15,000 and a 5-year life cycle. The power and cooling side of it, for a typical DL380 type server, you're going to be spending give or take $50 a month for power and cooling, and then your facility cost, depending on the size of your data center, obviously that fluctuates. But in this example, an on-prem cost of a physical server is almost $400 per month.
Okay, so got it. So $392.25. So remember that number because it's going to come back up again in another calculation. So if we go to the next slide, Hannah, and I actually see that we have something out of sequence. So skip ahead a slide and then skip ahead one more. Here we go. So here's an Azure calculation that we're going to use in this next example. So if we wanted to calculate the cost of the same physical server in the cloud, we would look at the OS license for the host cost divided by the 12, plus the backup cost, plus the storage management. So keep that in mind. Now if you go back to the slide that we should have been on, the second, here we go. Now we took actual real live examples off of a retail price list from Azure to come up with this 2-core 14 gig RAM VM as a cost comparison. So you can see that running this server on-prem boils down to a cost of $392 a month, or if we ran that same server in the cloud, it would be $231 a month. So that's one server in 1 month. Go ahead.
Right, and that assumes that server's running 24/7, 365 in the cloud, which it may not need to.
Exactly. So what we tried to do in these examples is be extremely conservative so that people know walking away from here that these are not pie-in-the-sky numbers. These are real conservative savings, and you dial them into your environment and they become more real, and the savings is almost too good to be true is what it amounts to. All right, let's go down to the next one with the virtualization calculation. So calculating out the cost of a VM. So I don't want to walk through this whole thing again, but you kind of get the idea. You look at your OS license costs, your backup costs, your hypervisor license costs, your hypervisor maintenance. So now we're looking at an actual VM as opposed to a server. And then, of course, the storage for the hardware, the maintenance for the hardware, the power and the cooling, the facilities, and all of that. So that's the math that we use. And then next slide. We already skipped that one because we just did it. Now here's an example of real-world costs with an actual customer that we did this exercise with. So I don't know if there's anything worth pointing out here, Clint, but I don't want to belabor this. You kind of get the math here. We actually sat with the customer, pulled out bills, pulled out invoices, and figured this out to get down to real-world numbers. And we came up with the fact that their VMs cost about $165 a month to run per VM. That number makes sense to you, Clint?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And keep in mind that that is per VM, not per server host.
Exactly, per VM. I think it's pretty eye-opening when you do this exercise. Nobody thinks that it could cost that much with their sunk costs. So now let's get down to the next slide where rubber meets the road again. So here we took our real-world example and we said, here's our VM cost, $165. Here's an actual retail price of a VM, $158. So running it 24 hours a day, you can see that we would save $7 a month at 100% run rate, which we know we don't run anything at 100%. Even at 80%, we're saving $31. At a 50% run rate, we're saving $79. So again, that's per VM. Imagine if you have 1,000 VMs, 500 VMs, even 100 VMs, the cost savings start to get very, very real. And again, anything to point out here, Clint?
No, I think you hit it directly. It's just keep in mind the savings. You're going to have many that you'll be able to save 50%, and some that will remain where they have to run 100%. So that 80% number is a pretty good mark to do some calculations for budgetary purposes. Okay.
All right, thanks. So I think, we started out saying this is a Mythbusters. There cloud savings or not, there definitely is. There definitely is. Back to the IDC report, a 560% overall 5-year return on investment, you can see how that can be a very real number, even though it's unbelievable. So let's talk about where do you start. So let's say you're convinced that security is there, the redundancy is there, I'm a believer, how do I start? What's the whole thing about public, private, hybrid, what does all that mean? And if I look at my environment, you can't start out boiling the ocean. Where do you start? Where do you start? So I know this slide says anywhere, and I know that all the cloud people that we work with here at Coretek who are writing tools and things like that, I love their phrase. It's the art of the possible. There is really nothing you can't do, but let's get real about it. Clint, where do you start?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different places you can start, and it really depends on what your specific requirements are and where you're at. But common places that people start are either sandbox, kind of app dev kind of environments to give developers the ability to have an area to cost effectively start up and shut down different servers for development purposes, as well as the two places that I really recommend is backup. It's very cost effective to get into Azure backup services. So if you think about all of your costs associated to leveraging getting disks offsite of some kind, so doing that actual storage and syncing it up somewhere, Azure is very cost effective from a backup perspective. Storage inside of Azure is very inexpensive. And then looking at that or DR sites for certain applications and or everything. Those are the two areas that I recommend people starting is one of those two, backup or DR, unless you have a specific need such as development or potentially you have a new application that's being delivered. That would be a good thing to start in the cloud as well.
So talking again from a customer perspective, being out there talking to customers and so forth, another thing that we see are compelling events. So for example, all-out data center refresh. How many of our customers are sitting on 5-year-old data centers and it's time to replace aging servers and storage and so forth? That's the perfect time to think about, okay, what can I move to the cloud?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you mentioned it already. We have another customer right now that has to bring up 2 new workloads, one by January and one by March. And same thing, bringing up those new workloads, bringing on entirely new divisions through mergers and acquisitions, which is still happening rapidly everywhere, every vertical. And as you either acquire someone new or add these new divisions, having to spin up new workloads for them, and then the great time to start thinking about, well, is this a time to be investing in more hardware on my already overcrowded data center, or should I look at, or what's the feasibility of putting that entire workload in the cloud? And we're helping customers make those kind of decisions today. And you mentioned the backups. Oh my gosh, what a no-brainer to move to the cloud. I can't believe how many Iron Mountain vans I still see out there on the roads today, and I can't imagine backing up, relying on tape media if I ever had to restore something. That seems pretty scary given the technology we have available to us today.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is you can quickly spin that data up inside of Azure if you ever had to. So starting there at least gets you to a starting point on some DR planning as well.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And how many tools that we have available where we can easily P to V, and so again, that's a problem in legacy data centers where if you're doing redundancy between data centers, you have to have like hardware on both sides for the data to run, and being able to go to the cloud, you're not constrained by that anymore. You don't need to run on the same storage platform or same hardware. All right, so let's go to the next slide. So we have our own framework for moving people to the cloud. Again, under the concept of you don't want to boil the ocean. There's compelling events, there's reasons, there's certain applications that just make sense. So can you walk us through the Coretek Cloud Migration Framework?
Yeah. So and this varies customer to customer, but this is like Cindy said, it's truly a framework that we leverage on how we help customers get to the cloud. So whether you use us or you do it on your own, one of the things to look at is, I mean, definitely go through that full assessment and discovery and building the roadmap. So understanding your total cost of ownership, understanding those financial sides. What is it actually costing you per VM, per workload? How does that cost really impact you? Looking at different security requirements and dependency mappings, and then from that taking it and doing that formal roadmap of prioritizing and building a detailed migration schedule, and then also look into what kind of tools you're going to need to leverage for that. And that varies customer to customer. It could be something as simple as if you're trying to leverage some sort of data file share, doing something as simple as DFS, distributed file systems, or it could be a full migration tool that you need for the particular application. It just could be anything in between depending on the application sets that you're looking on migrating. Then we go into the actual migration piece. So we build and test the Azure environment and the network side, make sure we have the proper connectivity between the two locations, whether that's a straight VPN or an express route, depending on the scenario, with how much data you have going across. But you know, creating that secure connection to Azure and ensuring that that architecturally your network's configured properly in Azure. And then we start, then we look into that transition model, and we test and verify the migration process. We do proof of concepts and user acceptance testing, and then look at starting to do that cutover and decommission of workloads. And then long term, once we're done with the migration, or even throughout it, depending on the agreement, we look at either training your staff and or taking over and managing those workloads and ensuring they're running optimally for you from both a cost perspective as well as functional for your users. And then we monitor and just continue to optimize it from an ongoing management perspective. And patching, and you got to put together all those different run books that you're going to use.
That makes sense. So, Clint, some common questions I get from customers, or I even want to call them myths, is it takes too long to move a VM, and I think that's a fact that when people first started moving workloads to the cloud, moving a VM could take like a whole day or more, but with tools, and I know that we have some tools, how many VMs, like how quick is that process? Once you build the framework, yeah, and you have the right tools, can you describe that a little bit better?
Yeah.
Like should that be a concern for a customer?
Yeah, so as long as you put together the right plan, it should not be a concern for you. There are a lot of different ways. It's matured significantly over the years. So if you've looked at this in the past, like let's say you looked at it a year or two ago, things have changed so much in this world. It's matured so much more. You can plan around that. I mean, you do have data constraints and transferring of data constraints, but there's so many different tools that you can leverage to minimize that. Even if you're moving, I mean, terabytes of data, it's okay. There are ways to handle that and handle that effectively.
Okay, cool. Good to know. All right, we're near the end. One more slide, and then we're going to bring us home here, Hannah. So I know that we have a key signature thing that we call Cloud Foundations. And Clint, can you explain the criticality of this slide?
Yeah, so a lot of people, whenever they're starting to set up their cloud environments, they go and they sign up for Azure, or they've signed up through their EA and they get provisioned Azure, and then they think they can just start working on it. Well, if you don't set it up correctly, if you don't set up your subscription management correctly with who has access to what, looking at how do you do your different resource groups inside of the subscription, looking at your network configuration, how scalable can you be depending on your network configuration? It's something you've got to consider, and then identity management. How do you handle your identity management within that Azure environment? And we leverage this, specifically this foundational architecture, and make sure that you're ready for long-term success. And that's one of the challenges we see a lot of people go through, is if they set it up incorrectly from the beginning. We start out setting you up correctly so that you can scale for your long-term vision.
That makes sense. It's all about building the right foundation. So another thing that pops up with customers, which we don't have time for in this session today, but we will be talking about in a future webinar, is Active Directory structures. Again, because it's such a common thing through mergers and acquisitions, we see so many environments that have, 10 domains and 3 forests, and boy, when you have a mess like that you're starting with, how do you start to make sense of it so that it's clean and you can cleanly move to the cloud and have your identity be solid going forward? But that's a whole nother webinar. So we'll look for that one in the future. So I can't thank everyone enough for being part of this webinar today. It will be made available on our website. And so next step, let's talk about that. We are happy to spend time with you to walk through this exercise with some workloads in your own environment and do a free cost analysis. It does get detailed in the weeds, but gosh, this is what we do, and we're happy to do it with you. Now again, because Coretek is a global managed services provider for Microsoft, we have access to funds from Microsoft to help you make this move. So we're offering up that if you give us a call, happy to extend this offer to you. We will do what we can to find what Microsoft funds are available to help you make this move. And for the right customers who are on Microsoft's list, we can get a minimum of $8,000 in Azure credit to help you make that move. Anything else you want to add to this, Clint?
No, I just thank you, everybody, for attending, and please reach out to us. Even if you have other questions and you just want to understand something about Azure, you want to understand a specific component, please feel free to reach out to us. We are here to support you in any way.
All right.
All right, at this point we're going to open it up for questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the question box, which you should see if you open the questions tab. All right, so it looks like we have a question here. And we talked about what workloads Coretek would recommend moving to the cloud, but this person asked, is there a tool to show what workloads would be best fit in the cloud?
So Clint, do you want to take that as, how do we do that analysis of looking at the workloads?
Yeah, so I don't know if there's a silver bullet, unfortunately, for you. Really, it's about analyzing what those workloads are and looking at how that can be leveraged. How can you deliver that data and or applications to the users? There definitely are a lot of no-brainer ones, such as looking at any sort of web-based applications and things like that. But when you get a step below that, it's really about doing that deep analysis. Wish I could give you a silver bullet, but
yeah, if it was a silver bullet, it would be a science. I guess today it's still an art.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Okay, well, I think that is all the questions. Again, thank you everyone for attending today. The live webinar will be sent out to, the link to the webinar will be sent out to everyone. And keep looking at the Coretek Services website for the next in the series. We're going to be digging into this topic more and more at a deeper level. So thank you again for joining.